In 2023, a truth no one dared to believe emerged from the shadows of nearly 40 years of silence. A 2-year-old girl who went missing in Alaska in 1985 had not died as everyone had thought, but had grown up, living a completely different life, under an identity that was not her own. In an instant, both sides of the tragedy were torn apart. An adult woman discovered she had never been who she believed she was, and a family was forced to confront the reality that the child they had mourned for decades was actually still alive somewhere out there. Today, I will take you straight into the eye of the storm of a cold case that has haunted America, what really happened on that fateful morning in Palmer, Alaska, why the initial investigation veered away from the truth, and how a child could vanish from both her family and the system for nearly 4 decades. This is not just a missing person case, it's a story of stolen identity, distorted memories, and small mistakes powerful enough to destroy an entire life. You are the ones helping stories like this come back to life. Take a deep breath, because right now we're about to embark on a journey that will make you wonder how many truths out there are still buried by time. Before diving deep into this shocking true story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you love journeys in search of forgotten justice, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next part. Alaska in 1985 was still a land standing apart from the frantic pace of modern America, where many small communities lived isolated from the rest of the country, not just geographically, but psychologically, with the feeling that danger was something far away, existing only on television or in stories from big cities down south. Palmer, an agricultural town in the Matanuska Valley, had the familiar feel of a community where everyone knew each other, where pickup trucks were parked in front of houses with doors unlocked, where kids could play outside in the yard, while adults only occasionally glanced out the window. Local police rarely had to handle serious cases. Evening news mostly covered weather, crops, and scattered traffic accidents on gravel roads. The Johnson family lived in a single-story wooden house on the edge of the residential area, not too far from downtown Palmer, but isolated enough to clearly feel the quiet of the outskirts, surrounded by trees and open land. Ethan Johnson, the father, worked in local construction, accustomed to long days of manual labor and coming home after dark, while Laura Johnson stayed home caring for their young child, maintaining a steady rhythm centered on meals, naps, and utterly ordinary routines. They weren't a perfect family by any particular standard, but they also had no conflicts, secrets, or instability that drew outside attention. Their life flowed quietly like most other families in Palmer at the time. Mary Johnson, just 2 years old, was the center of that rhythm, a child in the stage of learning to talk and run, curious about everything around her, but still completely dependent on adults, usually staying inside the house or playing in the area right in front of the porch, under the not constant, but trusting watch of those around her. The main witness that morning was Helen Parker, the next-door neighbor, a middle-aged woman who had known the Johnson family for years, often coming over to watch Mary for short periods when Laura was busy inside the house, a relationship based on familiarity and absolute trust, to the point that Helen's presence was never seen as something to be wary of. It was in that familiar setting that an unusual detail appeared, but wasn't enough to shatter the deep-rooted sense of safety in everyone's minds. A stranger, or a vehicle not belonging to the neighborhood, briefly appeared near the house, not stopping long enough to draw attention, with no clear actions that would prompt immediate response, and thus filed under those nothing to worry about things that everyone encounters in daily life. The initial reaction to that detail wasn't prolonged fear or suspicion, but the familiar self-reassurance of a community, rarely touched by crime, where adults believed bad things wouldn't happen here, at least not to them. The time Mary was out of supervision was very short, short enough that no one noticed the change right away, short enough that there were no unusual noises, no signs of chaos or struggle that would force adults to react immediately. Just a series of very small actions connected in the inherently slow pace of life. The mistake didn't come from indifference or irresponsibility, but from the very human limits of trust, habit, and the belief that a 2-year-old couldn't go far, and that in Palmer, danger was rare. When Laura came back to look for her child, and realized Mary was no longer in her usual spot, the first reaction wasn't immediate panic, but confusion, an unnamed empty feeling, followed by hurried searches inside the house, around the porch, calling her name in hopes that Mary was just hiding somewhere like before. As the spontaneous minutes of searching stretched on without results, confusion quickly turned to fear, leading to calling neighbors, expanding the search around the house, while the information Helen and others could provide was still just vague memory fragments, not clear enough to paint a complete picture. In that first hour, everyone clung to the assumption that Mary had just wandered off, that if they searched fast enough she would be brought back before things got worse, and that very belief meant the decision to call police wasn't made as a reflex to crime, but as a necessary next step in a situation they still thought they could control. The missing person call from the Johnson family was received at the Palmer Police Department, in a state where neither side fully realized a critical boundary had just been crossed, because at that point, the incident was still viewed as an emergency, needing assistance, rather than a potential criminal case, and the system's first reflex wasn't to hunt for a perpetrator, but to try to figure out where a 2-year-old might have gone within the narrow confines of the familiar neighborhood. The duty officer recorded basic information about the age, last seen time for Mary, surrounding context, and weather conditions, while on the other end of the line, Laura Johnson tried to organize her chaotic thoughts, to answer procedural questions she never imagined facing. The initial urgency assessment was heavily influenced by common assumptions in small Alaska communities at the time, where child abductions were so rare they almost only existed in national news, and thus, the police's first response had a lot of reassuring elements, with the belief that Mary might have just wandered around the house, or followed someone familiar briefly. A police team was dispatched to the scene, not in a high-alert state, but as part of emergency support protocol, and when the police car arrived in front of the Johnson home, it marked the moment the incident began shifting from a personal fear to a community and system issue. The approach to the scene happened quickly, but without signs of a proper lockdown or scene preservation for investigation, as the house remained open to neighbors coming and going. Those wanting to help moved freely, and no one thought each footstep or small movement now could alter the value of what remained. In the first minutes working with the family, police asked Ethan and Laura Johnson to recount the entire sequence from the morning up to discovering Mary missing, and right there, the state of shock began showing clearly through fragmented details, timelines that didn't perfectly match, and pauses when memories were interrupted by emotion. The answers were given in full cooperation efforts, but also carried the unavoidable confusion of people trying to recall every small action from a morning that had been utterly unremarkable. At the same time, Helen Parker's initial statement was recorded as the primary witness who last had direct contact with Mary before she vanished, and the trust in Helen, from both the family and community, meant what she recalled was almost accepted immediately, without necessary skepticism. From the initial accounts, a preliminary timeline was established, centered on the short period when Mary was no longer under direct adult supervision, and though these timestamps were only relatively accurate, they quickly became the foundation for the entire subsequent investigation direction. In the process, police conducted a preliminary assessment of the area inside and around the house, not to search for crime signs, but mainly to identify directions a child might go on her own, like the backyard exit, nearby dirt road, or openings leading to adjacent forest, and this very approach inadvertently reinforced the assumption that this was a lost child case rather than intentional external action. The missing child file was created as a necessary procedure, but even in that first document, the language used reflected the belief that the case could be resolved quickly, that timely searching would bring Mary back before nightfall or harsher weather. The initial investigation focus thus centered almost entirely on circling the surrounding area, based on the hypothesis that Mary left the house herself or followed someone familiar, while abduction possibility, though not completely ruled out on paper, wasn't prioritized in resource and time allocation. It was at this point that a pivotal decision was made without anyone realizing its long-term consequences. The chance Mary was taken by a stranger was assessed as very low, not enough to trigger deeper investigative measures or expand alerts beyond local scope. This early exclusion didn't stem from carelessness or irresponsibility, but from the social context, limited local force experience with such crimes, and widespread belief that the worst things happened elsewhere, not in Palmer. As the Johnson family began realizing the situation's severity through how police took notes, asked questions, and discussed among themselves, they still clung to hope their daughter was somewhere nearby waiting to be found. While the investigation system had inadvertently self-limited its actions from the very first hours, when a key hypothesis was demoted to secondary before enough data for objective evaluation. From the established initial investigation direction, the emergency search was deployed with focus on circling the area around the Johnson home, based on the assumption that a 2-year-old couldn't go far in such a short time, and thus, all first efforts concentrated on the nearest radius, where Mary was likely to have moved herself if she left without external intervention. Police and local residents quickly divided the surrounding area into search circles based on familiar paths, open land, dirt roads leading to the forest, and spots a curious child might be drawn to, while force assignment remained more flexible than strict, reflecting an urgent effort, but not yet organized under large-scale investigation structure. Terrain and weather assessment became an unavoidable factor from the early hours, as Palmer sat on the edge of vast forests where straying just tens of meters from residential areas could completely obscure view, and Alaska weather at that time, though not fully harsh winter, was cold enough to endanger a lost child if out too long. Search participants had to weigh each direction based on terrain slope, dense or sparse vegetation, and trace leaving potential, while wind and damp ground began blurring the smallest signs that could indicate Mary's movement direction. During sweeps of the first areas, some signs were discovered, but didn't fully fit the main hypothesis of Mary wandering alone, such as points that logically, a child that age would struggle to reach or cross without obstacles, and the absence of continuous traces typically seen when young children move alone on soft ground. These signs weren't clear enough for solid evidence, but enough to make some participants question if the initial assumption was missing something. When this information was reported back, it quickly became the topic of internal discussions among responsible officers and local experienced people, creating simmering tension between the need for quick action and caution in interpreting incomplete data. One side argued digging into unclear signs could slow the search and scatter resources, while the other worried ignoring them would repeat common missing person mistakes, where an early accepted hypothesis forces all later data to fit it. This debate didn't erupt into open conflict, but was enough to reveal approach differences, as some officers began discreetly expanding search in directions not fully in the original plan, while others stuck firmly to thorough sweeping of every meter near the Johnson home. Time passed, pressure mounted as hours of searching yielded no clear results, and weather conditions continued negatively impacting trace preservation, making what might have existed early on increasingly indistinguishable from natural environmental noise. It was in that context that a key decision was made, not as official admission the initial hypothesis might be wrong, but as precaution against the worst search radius was expanded beyond what a 2-year-old was thought capable of reaching alone, including roads leading out of Palmer and areas previously deemed low relevance. This decision marked a significant shift in search pace, as it implicitly acknowledged Mary might no longer be near the Johnson home, and clinging to the initial assumption could waste more precious time. Expanding the search radius brought changes in resource allocation, with more personnel mobilized, plans adjusted, and previously secondary information reconsidered, while for the Johnson family, it meant initial hope for quick resolution began giving way to vague fear their daughter might have been taken much farther than they ever imagined. The expansion of the search area forced the investigative team to temporarily pause the on-the-ground sweeping in order to systematize what was already known, and in that process, the initial investigative hypotheses were placed on the table as formal explanatory frameworks to guide the allocation of resources in the days that followed, each hypothesis carrying its own logic based on local experience, natural conditions, and the social context of Palmer in 1985. The first hypothesis, and the one most widely accepted in the early hours, was that Mary had wandered into the forest, a possibility that was always present in communities located right next to wilderness areas like Palmer, where the boundary between residential areas and nature was not clearly marked, and just a few steps in the wrong direction could lead a child into spaces that adults found difficult to access. According to this logic, Mary might have curiously followed a dirt path, a small trail, or an opening between rows of trees, and the search therefore needed to focus on thoroughly sweeping the forested areas near the home, stream banks, pits, and places where a child could become trapped or exhausted. This hypothesis fit the image of a 2-year-old child unaware of danger, while also aligning with the experience of local police, who had handled similar cases of getting lost in the woods and accidents, but it also required accepting that Mary had moved far enough on her own, without leaving a clear trail of traces, a point that began to quietly raise doubts within the team. The second hypothesis revolved around the possibility of a natural accident, a variation of the lost in the woods hypothesis, but focused on specific dangers of the terrain, such as falling into a pit, a ditch, or being swept away by a small stream that adults might easily overlook during the search. In the context of Alaska, where weather and terrain could quickly become harsh, this possibility was not considered unreasonable, and it provided an explanation for why Mary had not been found despite sweeping accessible areas. However, the natural accident hypothesis also faced similar limitations, as the areas deemed dangerous had been checked multiple times without discovering decisive signs, making continued heavy investment of resources in this direction increasingly less convincing to some involved in the investigation. The third hypothesis, that Mary had followed a familiar person, was built on the particular social structure of Palmer, where overlapping relationships and mutual familiarity made it not unusual for children to trail behind adults. From this perspective, Mary might have followed a neighbor, a family acquaintance, or someone who regularly appeared in the area without raising suspicion, and the disappearance therefore did not necessarily involve malicious intent. This hypothesis was strengthened by strong faith in the community, but it quickly revealed weaknesses when the list of known individuals was checked without yielding suspicious signs, and no one could confirm having taken Mary or seeing her with someone else. While the three hypotheses above were continuously discussed and adjusted, the possibility of abduction by a stranger remained as a theoretical option, but was not elevated to a central position in priority assessments. The evaluation of the abduction possibility was influenced by multiple factors at once: the rarity of similar incidents in the area, the lack of signs of violence at the scene, no clear testimony about a stranger approaching Mary, and the deep belief that Palmer was not a place where such acts could easily occur without detection. The officers involved in the investigation did not completely rule out this scenario, but they viewed it as a remote possibility, one that should only be examined more closely if the other directions were completely dead-ended, an approach that reflected caution based on local experience, but also inadvertently created a dangerous blind spot. In internal discussion, resource allocation was decided based on the highest assessed probabilities, and therefore, most manpower, time and equipment continued to be poured into search directions consistent with the lost in the woods and natural accident hypotheses. While efforts to verify the abduction possibility were carried out at a minimal level, mainly in the form of information sweeps and waiting for clearer signs, It was precisely this prioritization that created a systemic twist, as resources were concentrated on directions that seemed reasonable, but increasingly lacked supporting evidence, while the direction that could explain the most anomalies was sidelined because it did not fit the common perception of the community and past experience. The misallocation of resources did not occur as a single decision, but as the result of many consecutive small choices, each seeming reasonable in its own context, but when combined, they formed an investigative inertia that was difficult to reverse. As time continued to pass without a breakthrough, the initial hypotheses gradually shifted from guiding tools to thought patterns, causing every new piece of data to be evaluated based on whether it fit that pattern, rather than being considered independently. In that context, the possibility that Mary had been abducted did not disappear, but it was pushed into the gray area of the investigation, where it existed as a backup option, rather than an active direction of action, and it was this shift that shaped the entire early phase of the case. When the investigative system, though operating continuously, and with clear effort, was moving forward along a path that was increasingly diverging from the worst but possibly most accurate scenario. It was precisely from the way the initial investigative hypotheses had gradually taken shape and been prioritized according to what were deemed the most reasonable probabilities, that the search operation entered a new phase with greater scale, higher intensity, and full community mobilization, as Mary Johnson's disappearance was no longer viewed as a situation that could be resolved quickly, but had become a race against time, nature, and human limitations in Palmer. The local police force, which was thin and accustomed to handling minor incidents, was forced to call for support from neighboring areas, while issuing calls for volunteers from the community, because in Alaska, local residents, hunters, loggers, construction workers, farmers, often possessed field knowledge that no map or administrative record could replace. Dozens, then hundreds of people joined the search, organized into small teams responsible for specific areas, carrying compasses, flashlights, warm clothing, and basic supplies, moving in loose formations but with the shared determination that every unsearched patch of ground could be where Mary was waiting to be found. The mobilization of forces happened quickly, but also revealed inherent limitations of a campaign built under pressure, as not everyone was properly trained, not every area was clearly marked, and overlaps in search coverage sometimes caused resources to be spread thin, rather than concentrated. Alongside human efforts, support equipment was deployed to increase the chances of detecting traces in the vast and complex terrain, with search dogs expected to play a key role through their ability to track any lingering scent from the first hours after Mary vanished. The dogs were led through points believed to be places Mary had been, across the porch, the backyard, familiar paths, then continuing toward the forest and dirt roads leading away from the residential area. But the signals they gave did not form a clear movement trajectory, as the scent was sometimes strong, sometimes weak, then suddenly vanished at points inconsistent with the hypothesis that Mary had walked a long distance on her own. This interruption was explained in various ways, from weather effects, the movement of many people during the search, to the possibility that the scent had been disrupted by environmental factors, but it also planted in some investigators' minds an uncomfortable question about whether another factor was interfering with the picture they were not yet ready to confront. In addition to search dogs, vehicles like ATVs were used to access areas difficult to reach on foot, while helicopters, when conditions allowed, were deployed for aerial observation, scanning forests, open fields, and the expansive wilderness surrounding Palmer, in the hope that a high vantage point might spot something missed from the ground. However, sweeping the wilderness area quickly revealed the imbalance between the scale of Alaska's nature and human control capabilities, as dense forest cover, rugged terrain, and countless hidden spots made searching for a small child difficult to the point of near despair, especially as each passing hour further reduced the chances of preserving traces. The weather, already mentioned as an adverse factor from the start, began to play an even more decisive role, with rain and wind softening the ground and erasing fragile signs, while low temperatures heightened urgent and heavy concerns about Mary's survival chances if she was out in the wild. Each weather change not only affected search conditions, but also directly impacted the psychology of participants, as initial hope was gradually replaced by fatigue, anxiety, and fear that nature was steadily erasing the few remaining opportunities. Nevertheless, the search campaign continued to expand in both scope and intensity, not limited to forested areas near the Johnson home, but also including roads leading out of Palmer, parking lots, rest stops, and areas that could serve as transit points, reflecting an effort both to leave no possibility unchecked and to respond to growing pressure from the victim's family and community, who were beginning to realize this was no longer a short-term search. It was in that context, as fatigue and deadlock gradually took hold, that a piece of information emerged and quietly spread in internal discussions, carrying enough weight to shake the accepted assumptions: the presence of a strange individual in the area around the time Mary disappeared. Someone who did not belong to Palmer, and had no clear connection to the Johnson family, or anyone in the local community. Initially, this information was noted only as a minor detail, because in a small town, strangers were not always a sign of crime, and the lack of specific descriptions of identity, vehicle, or behavior made verification difficult. However, as search efforts continued to yield no results, that detail gradually emerged as a worrying possibility, especially as indirect accounts added that this person had left the area shortly after the disappearance, without leaving traces or explanation. Checking information related to this strange individual encountered many obstacles, from the lack of clear lodging records, no local ties, to the absence of legal grounds to expand the pursuit beyond Palmer, causing all efforts to stop at recording and monitoring. Within the search team, the appearance and disappearance of this potential suspect created differing views, with some believing it might just be an unrelated coincidence, while others began questioning whether the ongoing large-scale search was pursuing a subject no longer in the area. Whatever view prevailed, the reality was that this information was not strong enough to completely reverse the established search direction, and thus it was placed in the category of possibilities to note rather than a focus of action. As the search days continued with high intensity, but increasingly faint results, the overall picture grew heavy with the feeling that despite mobilizing maximum manpower, equipment, and local knowledge, despite sweeping vast areas within permissible limits, the truth about where Mary had gone remained out of reach, and it was in that void that the detail of the potential suspect appearing and vanishing began to play the role of a quiet but persistent twist, enough to sow doubt that the entire campaign was being guided by unverified assumptions, while another possibility, though harder to accept, might be being overlooked right in front of them. From the large-scale search campaign gradually revealing its clear limitations, the focus of the investigative effort was forced to shift toward re-examining human factors, particularly witnesses and sources of information that may have been overlooked in the early phase, because when nature provided no answers, all eyes turned to what people had seen, heard, and remembered, even if those memories were no longer intact. Additional statements began to be collected more systematically, not only from those present in the first hours after Mary vanished, but also from neighbors, passers-by, individuals who had been in the area at the same time, and even those who initially did not think what they observed was important enough to speak up. This process quickly revealed an uncomfortable reality. The memory fragments provided did not fit together into a clear picture, but instead created layers of overlapping information, sometimes directly contradicting each other, reflecting how time, pressure, and emotion could distort human memory. Details once considered certain began to change with each interview, as some witnesses adjusted the timelines they believed accurate, others added new elements not previously mentioned, and some admitted they had not disclosed everything they saw, because they thought it irrelevant or feared causing trouble for themselves. Among them, statements from key witnesses, including those considered most reliable in the community, began to reveal small but sufficient inconsistencies to raise doubts, as descriptions of strangers, vehicles, or directions of movement no longer matched those in the initial records. These contradictions were not enough to conclude that anyone was deliberately providing false information, but they created a fragile foundation for any hypothesis, relying too heavily on human accounts, especially when physical evidence was virtually non-existent. Alongside reviewing witnesses in Palmer, the investigative team began receiving tips from outside the town, a stream of information that brought both hope and the risk of derailing the ongoing effort, as every call, every report of seeing a child resembling Mary elsewhere forced them to weigh pursuing a new possibility against preserving already stretched resources. These tips came from various places, from nearby small towns to farther areas, where some believed they had seen a child with similar features, accompanied by an unidentified adult, and though most could not be verified, they were enough to introduce a new element of instability into the investigation. Verifying tips from outside Palmer required coordination beyond the local scope, and in some cases, this led to short-term involvement of federal agencies, units with more experience handling cross-jurisdictional missing persons cases. The appearance of the federal element did not mean the case was immediately upgraded to a full nationwide investigation, but it reflected acknowledgement that the possibility Mary had left Palmer, even left Alaska, was no longer too far-fetched to ignore. Cross-checks were conducted quickly, but within narrow time and authority limits, focusing on verifying the most credible reports, comparing descriptions, timelines and travel routes, but the results remained fragmented, with no tip strong enough to form a coherent chain of events. Within the investigative team, this created a simmering tension, as some argued that pursuing vague external tips only diluted local search efforts, while others contended that not seriously considering the possibility Mary had been taken far away was repeating the initial mistake. When hypotheses were prioritized based on familiarity, rather than all logical possibilities, it was in this context of debate that a realization began to form, not as an official conclusion, but as an increasingly hard-to-ignore doubt. If Mary had been taken by someone not from Palmer, then her leaving Alaska in the first hours or days after disappearing was entirely feasible, especially in a vast state with many poorly controlled routes, and a loosely monitored system at that time. This realization carried an important twist, as it forced the entire investigation to confront the possibility that most of the search efforts undertaken and ongoing might no longer be targeting the right objective, that traces at Palmer did not vanish due to nature alone, but because Mary had not been there for very long. However, turning this doubt into an official investigative direction faced practical barriers, from the lack of specific evidence showing Mary had been placed in a vehicle, taken along which route, to limits on authority and resources making expansion beyond Alaska difficult. While federal agencies could only intervene briefly, and to a certain extent, most responsibility reverted to local forces, who had to weigh continuing to pursue increasingly faint leads in Palmer, against accepting a hard-to-prove hypothesis that could explain many anomalies. As statements continued to change, external tips continued to arrive and be ruled out, and federal support gradually narrowed, the investigation fell into a suspended state, where no direction was strong enough to create a breakthrough, but no hypothesis was completely dismissed. It was this state that deepened the feeling that the truth about where Mary had gone lay beyond the reach of current investigative tools and frameworks, and that the possibility she had left Alaska very early, though not yet provable, had begun to quietly reshape how those involved viewed the entire case, no longer as a disappearance confined to a small community, but as a story that may have crossed geographical boundaries from the very first hours. As suspicions grew increasingly clear that Mary might have left Palmer very early, the investigation entered its most difficult phase, where every subsequent effort had to confront a stark reality. After days of searching and sweeping, no body had been found to confirm a tragic natural scenario. Nor was there any direct evidence that Mary had suffered an accident or harm within the previously delineated geographic area. The absence of a body, in some cases, could be seen as a sign of hope, but in this context, it became a major obstacle to the investigative process, because there was no physical endpoint to close off hypotheses related to getting lost in the woods or natural accidents, nor any basis to fully shift to a different direction with the necessary certainty. At the same time, the lack of decisive physical evidence meant that all attempts to reconstruct events relied largely on inference and statements, elements that had already shown significant limitations in earlier phases. No clothing, no personal items, no clear biological traces to determine direction of movement or method of leaving the area. The initial scene had essentially been flattened by time, weather, and the large-scale search activities themselves, making any remaining details hard to distinguish from environmental noise. This absence of physical evidence not only slowed progress, but also directly impacted the ability to mobilize additional resources, as every request for outside support needed to be grounded in specific facts, which the investigation no longer possessed at this point. In that context, the issue of suspects became particularly troubling, as after all the screenings, no individual emerged with enough credibility to become the focus of the investigation. The stranger mentioned during the large-scale search phase remained only a shadowy figure, with no clear identity, no specific itinerary, and no direct evidence linking him to Mary's disappearance, making pursuit of this lead a legal dead end. Other hypotheses, from acquaintances in the community to individuals who had passed through the area, were successively ruled out due to lack of evidence, leaving a dangerous void in the investigative picture, where there was no specific target to concentrate resources or build a prosecution file. As external leads gradually ran dry, the investigation began turning back to the Johnson family, not because of clear incriminating signs, but because in many unsolved missing persons cases, this was an almost unavoidable step once all other possibilities had been examined without results. This was done under the guise of re-examining relationships, daily habits, and details in the initial statements, but for the family, it quickly became a psychological burden, as the pain of losing their child was compounded by the feeling of being suspected and scrutinized. Ethan and Laura Johnson had to answer the same familiar questions again, explaining actions that had taken place on what seemed like a very ordinary morning, while every small detail was placed under the microscope of doubt, not because of new evidence, but because of the absence of evidence anywhere else. Although no findings were sufficient to shift the investigation toward a specific accusation, the process still consumed time and energy, while eroding the already fragile trust between the family and the system trying to find their child. It was at this stage that the deadlock became clearer than ever, not only in internal reports, but also in how the investigation was perceived by those directly involved, as every path seemed to lead back to the starting points without opening new ones. Efforts to re-examine files, cross-check statements, and review old leads yielded no breakthroughs, because the initial data had never been solid enough to withstand rigorous re-examination after days, even weeks. In that context, a hard-to-accept realization began to form within the investigative team: mistakes or limitations in the early phase, from scene assessment, prioritizing hypotheses, to resource allocation, had created gaps that could not be filled by later measures. Failing to properly preserve the scene in the first hours, dismissing the abduction possibility too soon, and letting time pass while other hypotheses were pursued, all combined into a chain of decisions whose consequences only became fully apparent when there were no new facts to compensate. This systemic twist did not appear as a clear individual error, but as the accumulated result of reasonable choices in each separate moment, yet when viewing the entire process, they formed an investigative inertia that made turning back nearly impossible. With no body to confirm an outcome, no physical evidence to build a case, no strong suspect to focus on, and no viable new direction, the investigation fell into a dangerous suspended state, where it continued to exist in name, but lacked the real momentum to move forward. For the Johnson family, this state prolonged the pain and ambiguity, as they were given neither a clear truth to accept, nor a specific hope to cling to. For the investigative system, it marked the point where the case began slipping gradually out of control, not due to lack of effort, but because what should have been done from the start could no longer be redone. The investigation, having reached the limits of every feasible approach, began to change, not with a decisive announcement, but through quiet adjustments in daily operations, as the search for Mary Johnson was no longer handled as an emergency requiring immediate response, but gradually shifted to a passive monitoring state in a system that always had to prioritize newly arising cases. Field search activities were cut back first, areas that had been swept multiple times were no longer revisited, and the mixed teams of police and volunteers were quietly disbanded, without any summary meeting or official community announcement, just the gradual absence of patrol vehicles and groups carrying maps and flashlights that had once been thickly present around the Johnson home area. The scaling down of the investigation occurred alongside changes in information handling, as new tips, if any, no longer triggered rapid responses, but were recorded, categorized, and placed on a pending list, depending on their specificity and verifiability, a process reasonable in theory, but meaning that many vague leads were never fully pursued. Personnel who had been attached to the case began to be reassigned to other duties, not because they believed the matter was resolved, but because the system did not allow maintaining a high level of focus on a file with no clear progress, and gradually, only a few officers remained responsible for maintaining the file, updating as needed, and serving as the contact point with the family. The case file was reorganized according to storage standards, with transcripts of statements, search reports, area maps, and hypotheses compiled into neater document sets, intended for future reference rather than ongoing investigative actions. In this process, Mary Johnson's disappearance was officially classified as a cold case, a technical term, but one carrying significant psychological weight, as it marked the shift from active investigation to a waiting state, where the case would only be reactivated if new information strong enough to break the prolonged silence emerged. The fact that the case was no longer a priority was clearly reflected in resource allocation, as proposals to expand the investigation or revisit low-probability hypotheses were no longer approved, and meetings related to the case became infrequent, more for updates than for seeking solutions. For the Johnson family, this change needed no explanation. They felt it through the growing intervals between contacts, through the absence of familiar investigators, and through the sense that their pain was gradually dissolving into the general flow of other unsolved files. Meanwhile, administratively, archiving the file required summarizing the case into concise records, and it was at this step that many seemingly harmless decisions were made, from choosing which details to emphasize in the summary, which to consider secondary, to how previously considered hypotheses were phrased. A small discrepancy appeared in this process, related to how an initial piece of information had been recorded and interpreted, not large enough to draw attention or spark controversy, but sufficient to alter the tone of the official file, causing one possibility once viewed as concerning to be blurred in the final summary. That discrepancy went undetected and uncorrected, not due to clear negligence, but because at that time, it was not seen as a factor that could salvage an investigation already depleted of leads, and because no one had the motivation to dig deep into a detail that offered no specific direction. When the file was placed on the storage shelf, that small discrepancy became part of the official story the system remembered about the case, existing alongside assumptions accepted in the early phase, and limitations deemed insurmountable. Over time, as personnel changed, and memories of debates and unresolved questions faded, the Mary Johnson file became a static set of documents, reflecting not only what had happened, but also the way the system had chosen to frame and preserve what happened. The cold case status provided the system with necessary stability, allowing resources to be reallocated to newer and more urgent matters. But it also locked Mary's disappearance into a temporal space, where everything seemed decided, even though many questions remained unanswered. The twist was that this overlooked file discrepancy, though it created no immediate consequences, quietly shaped how the case would be understood and approached in the future, establishing a ready interpretive framework that any later re-examination effort would have to confront. And as the investigation door closed quietly, no one could know that this seemingly minor detail would become the fragile boundary between a case forever forgotten and the possibility of being seen in a completely different light. When the file on Mary Johnson's disappearance was closed and placed on the storage shelf as a non-priority cold case, elsewhere, the life of a child bearing the physical appearance and age corresponding to Mary continued to flow without being tied to that name, in a context completely detached from Palmer, and bearing no clear traces of the past that the system had recorded and then forgotten. That child grew up under a different identity, called by a name with no legal or social connection to the Johnson family, and this new identity became the sole frame of reference for the girl's existence in relationships, documents, and how others perceived her. There was no family history, in the ordinary sense, no stories passed down about grandparents, relatives, or early memories transmitted from previous generations. The girl's childhood began as if dropped into the middle of life, without an opening chapter, with questions about origins or the past, either not asked or deflected with vague explanations, sufficient for a young child to accept without the ability to challenge. The absence of family history did not cause immediate disruption, because in the new environment it was covered by other factors, such as daily survival needs, adapting to the living space, and surrounding relationships, where a child learns to observe, imitate, and integrate, before learning to ask questions. Along with the lack of clear family history, was the near-complete absence of childhood documents, no newborn photos, no complete medical records from early life, none of the usual milestones recorded in the life of a child, continuously monitored from birth. These gaps, if placed in the context of a stable family and a tight administrative system, might have drawn attention, but in the environment where the girl grew up, they blended into other common deficiencies, becoming part of a reality few considered unusual. The new living environment had very different characteristics from Palmer, a broader but looser social space, where relationships formed and dissolved quickly, where personal stories were not always probed to their depths, and where a child could exist without being required to explain her origins. In that context, Mary's new identity was not challenged, as it fit just enough with what the system required to function at a minimum level, from attending school, accessing basic health care, to appearing in administrative records that did not demand deep verification. The girl grew up with the awareness that her world began from the point she could remember, and any gaps before that were filled with vague stories or silence, things young children often accept as an obvious part of life. The fact that no one asked questions was not the result of a collective conspiracy, but the consequence of many intersecting factors, from the looseness of oversight systems, the overload of those in authority, to society's natural tendency to accept what does not cause immediate disruption. Those around her, whether caregivers, teachers, or neighbors, saw a child present before their eyes, and responded to what they saw, not to what they did not know. And in most cases, the lack of past information was not seen as strong enough reason to doubt a reality operating smoothly. For the girl, life continued through normal developmental stages, learning to speak, walk, communicate, and form initial social reflexes, but all of this occurred on a foundation without clear anchors to the past, causing her sense of self to be built primarily from the present and what others reflected back. The earliest memories were not tied to a specific place or clearly named people, but existed as scattered sensory fragments, impressions hard to name that a child lacked the tools to interpret, and thus they were pushed down into the deeper layers of consciousness, not recognized as memories, but only as fleeting emotions without origin. The new living environment provided enough structure for the girl to exist and develop, but not enough depth to provoke probing the past, as everything around her was oriented toward continuing forward, adapting, and meeting the immediate demands of life. The fact that no one asked questions became a foundational condition for the new identity's existence, as both the system and the individuals involved operated on the assumption that what was happening was valid, since there was no clear evidence to the contrary. Over time, the absence of a past was no longer felt as a void, but as a normal state, where questions never formed also did not create obvious unease. However, this very normalization created a quiet paradox. A person growing up without a confirmed starting point, without family history for reference, without childhood documents as markers, and without anyone asking questions deeply enough to force the system to look back. Throughout those years, Mary's new identity existed not because it was proven correct, but because it had never been proven wrong, and in a society that operates more on assumptions than comprehensive verification, that was enough for a life to continue flowing without interruption. That childhood without a past, viewed from the outside, might not bear clear signs of tragedy, but the very absence of every authentic anchor made it an empty space, where the truth about origins was imprisoned, not by a tightly locked door, but by collective silence, and the inertia of a world that always prioritizes what is happening over what has been left behind. The collective silence that allowed a childhood without a past to exist was the same silence that created the conditions for a new identity to form and function as if it had always been there, starting with a birth record that contained numerous irregularities but was valid enough to pass through administrative doors that demanded only superficial completeness rather than absolute authenticity. This record emerged without being tied to a specific medical facility in the usual way, lacking the typical details about the place of birth, the attending witness, or early medical confirmations, but it was completed with the minimum necessary information for the system to accept it, reflecting a reality of lax legal standards in many localities and periods, where late birth registrations, supplemental registrations, or information adjustments were not uncommon. The person assuming legal responsibility for the child was not the biological parent according to any records, but rather a self-appointed guardian with sufficient authority to sign and provide information without being required to fully prove the relationship under strict standards. The role of this guardian was decisive in shaping the new identity, as they were the sole bridge between the child and the system, the one providing the foundational story, albeit vague, about origins and circumstances, sufficient to answer basic questions without triggering deeper scrutiny. In the legal environment of that time, where administrative agencies operated under heavy workloads and limited resources, such records were not always viewed as suspicious, especially when they involved no disputes, complaints, or clear signs of fraud. A lax legal system does not mean the absence of laws, but rather the existence of gaps between regulations and enforcement, where many procedures relied on the assumed honesty of the applicant more than on independent verification. In that context, the lack of cross-checking between databases became a key factor, as information about a child could be recorded in one locality without being compared to missing persons lists elsewhere, especially when there were no direct indicators requiring the system to perform such cross-checks. Databases existed in isolation, not connected in a way that allowed detection of subtle overlaps or contradictions, and thus, a new identity could be recorded, stored, and used for years without triggering any automatic alerts. The guardian continued to play a central role in maintaining the superficial consistency of this identity, providing information when needed, avoiding questions that could lead to deeper scrutiny, and shaping the child's personal story in a simple, low-detail way that was enough for outsiders to accept. The concealment did not occur as a dramatic act or a sophisticated plan laid out from the start, but as a series of small choices, each aimed at avoiding unnecessary attention, at keeping everything in a state of normalcy, according to the lowest standards the system required. Deficiencies in the record, rather than being seen as warning signs, were explained as consequences of difficult circumstances, frequent moves, or familiar administrative glitches in the eyes of those processing paperwork. The lack of cross-checking was further reinforced by the fact that no one in the processing chain had a personal motive to dig deeper, as doing so offered no clear benefit, while potentially bringing unnecessary responsibility and trouble. For the child, the fabricated identity became the only reality she knew, reinforced through repeated use of the new name, the first documents, and the consistent reactions of the guardian and surrounding environment to it, leaving no opportunity for latent doubts to form. Over time, this identity existed not just on paper, but became embedded in daily life, serving as the foundation for attending school, accessing basic services, and building social relationships, a process that increasingly blurred the boundary between truth and social acceptance. The twist lies in the fact that the intentional concealment did not necessarily stem from a long-term plan designed to deceive the entire system, but from the awareness that the fewer questions asked, the lower the risk of discovery, and thus, every action was directed toward maintaining minimal information. It was this very minimalism, combined with legal gaps and the lack of database connectivity, that created a passive layer of protection for the new identity, where the truth was obscured not by a solid wall, but by the functional indifference of a system designed to handle large volumes of records, rather than to detect rare exceptions. As the fabricated identity continued to operate smoothly over the years, it was gradually reinforced, not only by documents, but by practice, as each acceptance made it realer in society's eyes. And in that process, the concealment, though intentional at certain key moments, was perfectly disguised under the cover of familiar administrative deficiencies, meaning the new identity did not need to prove itself correct, but only needed to avoid being proven wrong, a seemingly fragile condition yet strong enough to endure persistently in a system that operated more on assumptions and inertia than on comprehensive verification. The identity that was fabricated and maintained smoothly through the early years continued to follow her into adulthood, as life began demanding more interactions with society and the system, yet it still operated smoothly enough to avoid confronting fundamental questions about origins. Education followed a relatively stable path, with school years recorded by minimal but valid administrative records, where the name and date of birth were accepted as default facts, not cross-referenced with any system beyond the local scope. She learned to adapt to the school environment, neither standing out in a way that drew special attention, nor facing serious obstacles that would force the school or related agencies to delve deeply into her personal circumstances, and this very sufficient normalcy became an invisible layer of protection for the constructed identity. When entering the phase of choosing a career path, decisions were made pragmatically, prioritizing jobs that did not require deep background checks or frequent contact with public authorities, reflecting an instinctive avoidance rather than a conscious strategy. Work provided income and structure to daily life, but did not create long-term attachments to a specific organization or professional community, making her labor journey fragmented, suited to an identity that existed enough to function, but not solidly enough to withstand prolonged scrutiny. In social relationships, she built connections at a moderate level, enough to avoid isolation, but not so deep as to invite difficult questions about family, past, or ordinary life milestones that others took for granted. Friends and colleagues saw the person present before them, responding to behavior and personality revealed in the present, not to gaps in the biography they were not encouraged to explore. And thus relationships formed, based on selective sharing, where easily discussed parts were offered, while harder-to-name parts were withheld. Avoidance of public authorities, did not manifest as overt fear or resistant behavior, but as cautious choices in everyday life, from limiting unnecessary contact with complex administrative procedures, to delaying or avoiding situations that could lead to cross-verification of personal information. These reflexes were not learned from specific instructions, but formed gradually through life experience, like an unexplained sensitivity to the possibility that too many questions about documents and origins could expose things that even she did not fully understand. In many situations, this avoidance was justified by convenient reasons, fatigue with bureaucracy, or a desire for a simple life, explanations reasonable enough that no one felt the need to probe further. Nevertheless, beneath the surface of a normally functioning life, a feeling of not belonging began to emerge as a persistent psychological state, not tied to a specific event, but permeating ordinary moments, when she realized she lacked the common anchors others used to define themselves, such as family stories, traditions, or memories shared across generations. This feeling was not always clear, sometimes just a slight offbeat in conversations, when others talked about childhood, where they grew up, or the faces that witnessed their growth, while she chose to listen more than participate. At other times, it surfaced as an uncomfortable vagueness, when she tried to envision her own past, but only encountered gaps or fragmented memories that did not connect into a coherent story. The absence of a clear family history made intimate relationships, especially those requiring deep sharing, more complicated, as each step closer carried the risk of facing questions she had no convincing answers for. In that context, maintaining a certain emotional distance became a self-protective strategy, allowing her to exist in relationships without being forced to define herself by standards she could not meet. The feeling of not belonging also manifested in how she moved between living spaces, never attaching long-term to a specific place, as if staying too long somewhere could invite unwanted attention or highlight inconsistencies in her personal story. These changes, though outwardly explainable by work or economic circumstances, contributed to reinforcing a transient lifestyle where stability was maintained at the minimum necessary level but never reached a depth that created profound security. In the process of maturing, she learned to read social cues, knowing when to speak and when to stay silent, how to adjust her story to fit the context without direct lying, simply by omitting inconvenient parts. This ability helped her integrate well enough not to be seen as different, but it also made the sense of a complete self more faded, as the boundary between the real person and the one presented to society became harder to distinguish. Adult life thus unfolded as a continuous series of adaptations, where each choice aimed to keep the fabricated identity running smoothly, even if the price was the absence of a clear sense of belonging. She existed, worked, built relationships, and made decisions in a world that accepted her as part of it, but that acceptance was not enough to fill the internal void, as it was not based on a verified past foundation. In the quiet of daily life, the feeling that she was living on an incomplete story continued to follow her, not strong enough to force action, but persistent enough to tinge every achievement and relationship with a layer of vague unease, as if she were standing on ground that appeared stable, but lacked the deep roots needed to truly belong anywhere. The feeling of not belonging that had followed her throughout adulthood gradually transformed into a form of awareness, difficult to name, where memories did not appear as coherent stories, but as fragmented sensations, lacking clear chronological order, and not tied to any specific context she could rationally confirm. These memories did not carry clear images of people or places, but often emerged as pure sensations, like the damp cold smell of air, the feeling of someone's hand gripping too tightly, the muffled sound of an enclosed space, or a sudden shift in light forcing the eyes to adjust abruptly. They arrived unexpectedly in the most ordinary moments, without clear triggers, then vanished quickly, leaving confusion more than fear, as she could not determine whether they were real memories or mere products of imagination. Over time, these sensory fragments began repeating with certain consistent features, forming small but persistent obsessions, leading her to realize they were not entirely random, though she still lacked the cognitive tools to assemble them into a meaningful story. At night, recurring nightmares appeared as another variation of the same phenomenon, not following a clear script, but revolving around intense emotional states, such as being separated, placed in a strange space, or observed without being able to name the observer. In those dreams, she often saw no specific faces, heard no clear words, only felt pressure and helplessness, a feeling so familiar that upon waking, she could not tell if it was something new or just a continuation of a state that had existed for a very long time. These nightmares did not occur in easily recognizable cycles, but in waves, sometimes months apart, then suddenly returning with greater intensity, causing her to wake in a state of tension without understanding the cause. Alongside the sensory memories and nightmares, abnormal psychological reflexes gradually became evident in daily life, not severe enough to be diagnosed as a clear disorder, but consistent enough to create a difference from others' typical responses. She tended to startle excessively at sudden sounds, feel discomfort when touched unexpectedly, and react strongly to enclosed or dimly lit spaces, though she could not explain why. These reflexes did not always appear, but when they did, they carried a disturbingly familiar feeling, as if the body was responding to a threat that had once existed, even though consciousness could not identify what it was. In many cases, she tried to rationalize these reflexes with more logical causes, like work stress, prolonged fatigue, or a sensitive personality, and most people around her accepted those explanations without further questions. However, the repetition of these reflexes in certain patterns gradually created a quiet doubt within her that there might be a layer of experience pushed out of conscious awareness, but still influencing how the body and emotions responded to the world. The cognitive gap became clearer when she tried to recall her early years, not through detailed recollection efforts, but by searching for any emotional marker or image that could serve as the starting point of her personal story. Instead of finding a gradual sequence of memories by age, she only encountered a foggy region where the early years existed as an impenetrable void, with no clear memories to hold on to, nor a sense that they had once existed and been forgotten. This gap differed from ordinary forgetting, as it did not carry the sense of loss for something once possessed, but resembled a part of history never formed in awareness, creating an inexplicable disconnection between sensation and story. When facing this gap, she felt not just curiosity, but a form of indefinable unease, as if the absence of memories was not merely a personal limitation, but a sign of something concealed or unaccessed. In the rare moments when she tried to discuss this with others, the response was usually familiar reassurance that many people do not remember childhood clearly, that memories can fade over time, and that not remembering does not necessarily carry deeper meaning. Those reassurances, though reasonable on the surface, did not fully convince her, because what she experienced was not just faintness, but a structured absence, where a critical life stage left no commensurate cognitive imprint. The existence of fragmented sensory memories further highlighted this paradox, as the body seemed to remember things consciousness could not access, creating an internal split between what was felt and what could be recounted. Over time, she learned to live with this split, not seeking to resolve it completely, but setting it aside as a strange but unchangeable part of herself, since delving deeper seemed to offer no clear answers and only increased unease. However, avoidance did not completely eliminate the impact of these fragmented memories, as they continued to appear in unpredictable situations, affecting decisions, relationships, and how she responded to the world, even though she could not name their origin. During stressful periods, the abnormal psychological reflexes became more pronounced, as if the thin layer of conscious control weakened and allowed deeper responses to surface, reinforcing the sense that what was happening was not just a product of the present, but connected to an unrecognized experience. The cognitive gap, therefore, was no longer an abstract detail but became a shaping factor in lived experience, influencing how she viewed herself and the surrounding world. She existed in an intermediate state, where the past was not entirely absent, but also not present as a recountable story, where memories appeared as sensations and reflexes rather than images and words. This state did not lead to an immediate crisis, but created a simmering foundation of instability, where each new experience was filtered through a layer of emotion without clear origin, and each effort at self-understanding hit a murky wall of inaccessible early years. In the silence of those fragmented memories, a question not yet fully formed still persisted, not in words, but as a lingering feeling that her personal story was missing a crucial chapter, and that those sensory fragments, nightmares, and abnormal reflexes might be the only remaining traces of something that had happened, but had never been named. The fragmented memories, recurring nightmares, and abnormal psychological reflexes did not fade over time, but quietly accumulated, creating a simmering pressure that gradually made her dissatisfied with reassuring explanations like everyone forgets their childhood, or memories can fade, because her experience was not like ordinary forgetting, but rather like the complete absence of a cognitive foundation for her early years. The motivation leading to the decision to take a DNA test did not stem from a dramatic moment or a specific discovery, but from the intersection of many small factors: a prolonged sense of not belonging, a cognitive void that could not be filled by memories or family stories, and an increasingly strong curiosity about whether the deep-seated reactions of her body were reflecting an unrecognized truth. That decision was made in a context where DNA testing had become more common in everyday life, no longer limited to criminal investigations or medical cases, but promoted as a tool for exploring ancestry, connecting relatives, and satisfying personal curiosity, a framework neutral enough for her to feel safe approaching it. The choice to proceed with the test was made cautiously, without any specific expectations beyond the desire for one more piece of objective information, as she did not imagine that the results could shake the entire foundation of the identity she had lived with for many years. The testing process itself was relatively simple, technical, and emotionally detached, involving providing a biological sample, filling in basic information, and accepting standard terms of use, steps that did not require recounting her personal story or explaining her past, making her feel it was merely an exploratory action rather than a turning point. During the waiting period for the results, life continued as usual, with no signs indicating a major change was imminent, and that very normality meant she was not psychologically prepared for the possibility that the incoming data might not align with her most basic assumptions about herself. When the test results were returned, what stood out was not the discovery of unexpected genetic traits or ethnic origins, but the absence of any matches with the family relationships she had believed were hers, a data void far more profound than any numbers or percentages. This non-match was not presented as a definitive conclusion, but as a set of indicators showing no close genetic connection between her and the people considered her family under her current identity, information clear enough to be undeniable, yet vague enough not to immediately provide an alternative explanation. Her initial reaction was not panic or strong denial, but profound confusion, as this objective scientific data directly contradicted the social reality she had lived for years, forcing her to confront the possibility that her identity might not match her biological truth. Doubt began to form not as a clear hypothesis, but as a sense of misalignment between what she had always believed and what the data had just revealed, a feeling similar to her earlier abnormal psychological reflexes, but now with a more concrete anchor to hold onto. She reviewed the information provided in the results, searching for possible technical errors, sample mix-ups, or database limitations as a way to delay accepting the deeper implications of the discovery, but even accounting for those possibilities, the complete absence of close genetic links remained something hard to explain as random error. The doubt about her identity gradually shifted from a fleeting thought to a serious question as she began cross-referencing the test results with long-existing gaps in her personal story, from the lack of clear family history to the shortage of childhood documents and unexplained psychological reflexes. Each individual element could previously be explained by circumstances or coincidence, but when placed alongside the DNA data, they began forming a pattern that was hard to ignore, where the anomalies no longer stood alone, but connected under a new logic. Accepting the possibility that her current identity might not reflect her true biological origins did not happen immediately, as it required restructuring her entire understanding of herself, her family, and her past, a process threatening to the psychological stability built over years. She tried proposing less disruptive scenarios, such as informal adoption, record mix-ups, or other complex personal situations, but each ran into unanswerable questions, especially without reliable documents or accounts to support them. In this process, the DNA result was no longer just scientific data, but a catalyst that labeled and sharpened previously vague feelings, turning nameless unease into a specific question about origins and identity. The doubt about her identity did not immediately lead to broad truth-seeking actions, but first created an internal shift in how she viewed her past life, as fragmented memories, nightmares, and abnormal reflexes began to be seen as potential signs of an interrupted story, rather than isolated psychological glitches. In the days and weeks after receiving the results, she continued living in a state of hesitation, wanting to dig deeper for answers while fearing it would bring irreversible consequences, because once the identity question was seriously posed, it could no longer be pushed aside as before. The parallel existence of everyday life and the newly formed doubt created a simmering tension, where every social interaction or personal document could remind her that the foundation of familiar things might not be as solid as she had thought. In that state, the decision to take a DNA test, originally made as a personal curiosity, had inadvertently opened a new door of awareness, where objective data directly challenged the personal narrative built over years, and though she was not yet ready to step through that door decisively, the doubt about her identity had been planted deeply enough that it could no longer be ignored, marking the moment when the question, "Who am I?" was no longer an abstract reflection, but a concrete issue tied to data, memories, and the void she had carried throughout her life. The doubt about her identity following the initial DNA test results did not immediately lead to answers, but it created a new, more systematic need, as the raw data was no longer seen as an isolated discovery, but as a starting point for searching farther connections through genetic genealogy, a method relying not on memories or administrative records, but on genetic traces shared across generations. The distant matches that appeared were faint but meaningful signals, not close enough to identify direct relationships like parents or siblings, but clear enough to show biological connections to individuals completely unknown in her current life. Each match carried a small percentage of shared DNA, a seemingly abstract number that acted like milestones positioning her on a vast genetic map, where each distant connection was a potential clue leading back to her true origins. Approaching these matches was not emotional but methodical, as she and experts began analyzing the data, cross-referencing relationships among matched individuals to build hypothetical family trees. The process of building the tree was like solving a puzzle backward, starting from the present and tracing distant connections to find convergence points in the past, where family branches might meet. Every small piece of information, from birth locations and estimated birth years to publicly available civil records, was used to create an increasingly clear structure, though still with many gaps and assumptions needing verification. In this process, eliminating family branches was as important as identifying suitable ones, as each eliminated branch narrowed the search and reduced noise from unrelated connections. Branches with migration histories, circumstances, or birth times incompatible with her data were gradually set aside, not by a single decision but through patient cross-checking of genetic and civil information. The deeper the process went, a pattern emerged. Many seemingly unrelated distant matches shared a common geographic origin, concentrated in a specific area in the past, creating an undeniable axis of connection. The link to Alaska did not appear as an instant discovery, but as a gradually forming result, as family branches were overlaid, showing some common ancestors who had lived in or had long-term ties to the state. That information was initially suggestive, rather than conclusive, as Alaska is a large state with a complex migration history, and some branches leading there did not automatically explain the break in her personal identity. However, as the data was refined, incompatible branches eliminated, and remaining ones all pointed to the same geographic area in a specific time period, the likelihood that her biological origins were directly tied to Alaska became increasingly hard to deny. The process was not only technical, but carried significant psychological weight, as each advance in building the family tree meant redefining part of her personal story, not based on what she had been told, but on what DNA silently preserved. As the geographic scope narrowed, identifying plausible scenarios became clearer, no longer infinite as before, and the question shifted from whether her current identity was correct to where her true identity might lie in the narrowed picture. The twist came when the narrowing process did not lead to many potential cases as expected, but instead left only a very few scenarios fitting all cross-checked data, including age, birth timing, record gaps, and distant genetic links. Among these, only one case stood out for its near-perfect match in timing and context, a case involving a child who disappeared years ago in Alaska, leaving a record gap corresponding to the gap in her own personal story. Narrowing down to a matching victim was not presented as a certain conclusion, but as a strong hypothesis, powerful enough to connect scattered pieces into a logical picture, yet frightening enough to make her hesitate before accepting it. Everything once seen as random, from the sense of not belonging, fragmented memories, and abnormal psychological reflexes, to the non-matching DNA results, now could be placed under a common causal axis where the identity break was no longer abstract, but the consequence of a specific event from very early on. Genetic genealogy, thus not only provided new information, but completely changed how old data was interpreted, turning details once seen as administrative oversights or personal traits into meaningful signs in a larger story. Though without official confirmation or agency involvement, narrowing to a matching victim created a convergence between science and memory, objective data, and subjective experience, where for the first time, the possibility of answering the origins question was no longer a vague assumption, but a specific direction, clear enough to make her realize that the path ahead, though still uncertain, was no longer infinite, and that Alaska from a distant place name had quietly become the center of a story, in which she had never known she was the main character. Narrowing down to a missing person case that matched in timing and genetic data meant the search could no longer remain personal or independent, but had to move to a new phase, where hypotheses formed from genetic genealogy needed to be compared against official records to verify their legality and practicality. The Alaska Cold Case Unit received the information as a request for review, not asserting a concluded finding, but as a possibility, requiring careful evaluation in the context of a case dormant for many years. The intake did not occur with the outward urgency of new cases, but carried a different level of focus, as any error in reopening could repeat past mistakes. The cold case investigators began by requesting all records related to the 1985 disappearance, including witness statements, search reports, scene diagrams, hypothesis lists, and administrative summaries prepared when the case was archived. Reviewing the 1985 records was not about finding an accidentally overlooked detail, but understanding how the case had been shaped, which assumptions were accepted, which directions were ruled out, and why those decisions seemed reasonable at the time. Reading the old documents revealed first, not a clear error, but the imprint of the era's social context and investigative capabilities, where many decisions relied on local experience, technological limits, and common assumptions about community safety. The initial notes reflected an investigation that had tried within its constraints, but also showed how some possibilities were downgraded, not for lack of logic but for lack of tools to pursue them fully. With the records now in the hands of investigators not involved in the original case, comparing old data to new became central, as the very difference between eras could expose mismatches. Genetic genealogy data, with its ability to connect strangers through genetic traces, was cross-referenced with age, birth timing, and disappearance circumstances in the 1985 file, creating a comparison axis that did not exist before. Timelines once approximate were re-examined with greater precision, details once secondary placed against biological facts to see if they still fit. In this process, investigators realized some old file information had been standardized in ways that lost initial complexity, as small inconsistencies in statements or unverified details were merged into a neater narrative for archiving. Comparing old and new data was not just matching numbers or names, but placing two perspectives side by side, one from a time of limited technology and community pressure, the other from the present with genetic data and enough emotional distance for re-evaluation. In that comparison, discrepancies emerged not as outright errors, but as a chain of interpretations shaped by inertia, causing some possibilities to fade in official summaries. One specific discrepancy, once noted as minor when archived, now placed in the new context, showed far greater impact than previously understood, as combined with DNA data, it became a key piece, rather than ambiguous. Discovering this discrepancy was not a dramatic aha moment, but a gradual realization, as investigators saw the 1985 file not only recorded events, but reflected how the system chose to frame and conclude the case within its limits. The existence of discrepancies did not mean intentional wrongdoing, but showed how an initial assumption, repeated across records and summaries, could become truth on paper even without independent verification. For the cold case unit, this was not an accusation of the past, but a signal the case needed fresh review with new tools, where biological data, interstate connectivity, and time allowed questions impossible before. Reopening the file was thus not just administrative, but a shift in approach, as Mary Johnson's disappearance was separated from rooted assumptions in old records, to be examined as an unresolved chain of events. In that context, each document page was reread, not just for information, but to understand the logic guiding the prior investigation, pinpointing where inertia replaced evidence. The old-new data comparison created a new investigative space, where details once deemed unimportant now took center stage, not because they changed, but because the context changed how they were understood. When the cold case unit completed the initial review, the 1985 file was no longer a static set of documents, but a foundation needing restructuring, where even small discrepancies had to be clarified before further steps. Discovering discrepancies did not yield immediate answers, but confirmed something vital. The case was not closed because solved, but because the system reached its limit. Then, and with emerging new data, that limit was no longer fixed. The fact that the file had been restructured with distortions just identified made the next step unavoidable, returning to the human element, where the statements once regarded as the foundation of the initial investigation now needed to be placed under new light, not to find individual fault, but to understand what had been said, what had been left out, and why. The investigators began re-interviewing the surviving old witnesses, those who had appeared in the 1985 records in key or supporting roles, approaching them with a temporal distance large enough to reduce immediate pressure, but also long enough for memories to have been eroded, restructured, or altered in ways that even their owners did not fully recognize. These interviews did not take place in the urgent atmosphere of a hot case, but were retrospective in nature, focused on allowing witnesses to retell the story in their current way before comparing it to what they had said in the past. From the very first contacts, changes in the statements began to emerge, not always on a large scale, but enough to show that what had once been recorded as stable truth had actually been affected by time, emotion, and social context. Some witnesses adjusted the timelines they believed were accurate, admitting that in the panic of the early days, they had estimated rather than clearly remembered, while others added details they had not mentioned before, not because they were new, but because at the time they did not think they were important, or did not want to cause further trouble. There were statements that changed in the direction of downplaying their own role, as witnesses sought to distance themselves from decisions or observations that might be seen as mistakes, and there were also statements that became more detailed, as the passage of time allowed them to look back at the events from a different perspective, less influenced by fear or community pressure. In this process, the investigators did not seek absolute consistency, because they understood that human memory is not a fixed record, but paid attention to the points where change might reflect a suppressed truth or something that had not been said from the beginning. Alongside the changing statements, the reality of deceased witnesses began to cast a shadow over the entire retrospective investigation effort, as some individuals who had held important pieces of information could no longer be questioned, leaving permanent gaps in the picture of events. The file noted that some had passed away due to age or illness, taking with them memories that could never be verified again, while others had been out of contact for so long that they could not be located, or no longer had the cognitive capacity to participate in interviews. This absence was not just a technical obstacle, but a factor shaping how the retrospective investigation had to be conducted, as every remaining answer had to be weighed in the context of what could no longer be asked. The investigators were forced to work with an incomplete set of information, where each new statement had to be placed not only against the old file, but also against the silence of those no longer there to confirm or refute. It was in this context that a troubling pattern gradually emerged, as some witnesses, though still alive and capable of cooperating, continued to evade or withhold information, not because they did not remember, but because they did not want to remember, or did not want to speak. This silence did not take the form of outright refusal, but manifested through evasive answers, deliberate vagueness on key points, or shifting focus to less relevant details, creating a soft but durable wall against efforts to dig deeper. When comparing current statements to old records, the investigators realized that this silence was not a new phenomenon, but had existed from the very first days of the investigation, only differing in that back then it was covered by chaos and time pressure, while now it stood out more clearly in a context that allowed comparison and analysis. The twist was that this silence could not be fully explained by fear or confusion, because in some cases witnesses indirectly admitted that they had chosen not to say everything they knew, because they believed it would harm someone, or disrupt the stability of the community. That choice, made in the context of a small town, where relationships overlapped and mutual dependencies created implicit pressure, was not always consciously seen as an act of concealing a crime, but as a right decision to avoid conflict or unforeseen consequences. For the retrospective investigation, this discovery carried profound meaning, as it showed that not all gaps in the file were the result of systemic limitations or time, but that some stemmed from deliberate human choices, choices that had shaped the direction of the case from the start. The investigators had to confront the reality that reconstructing events was not just a technical or data issue, but also a matter of decoding the social and psychological motives that had caused some truths to be suppressed. In subsequent interviews, the effort no longer focused on forcing witnesses to provide new information, but on understanding the context of that silence to determine whether it stemmed from fear, loyalty, guilt, or personal calculation. The changes in statements, when viewed through this lens, were not just signs of fading memory, but clues about how the case had been managed at the community level, where unacceptable things were pushed out of the official narrative. The fact that some witnesses had died limited the ability to verify these suspicions, but it also highlighted the responsibility of those still alive, as they had to face the question of whether their prolonged silence had contributed to the truth being buried. For the cold case unit, the retrospective investigation was thus not just about gathering more information, but about understanding the structure of missing information, identifying which gaps could never be filled, and which had been created by human choice. Intentional silence, once identified, did not immediately point to a perpetrator or explain the entire case, but it fundamentally changed the way the file was reread, because it showed that what was not said could be as important as, or even more important than, what had been recorded. In that state, the retrospective investigation moved forward with a new awareness that every statement, old or new, had to be placed in the context of the invisible motives that had shaped it, and that the truth, if it existed, lay not only in data or individual memory, but in the complex intersection between people, community, and decisions made in silence many years before. What was revealed through the retrospective investigation, from changing statements to intentional silences, made proceeding to identity confirmation no longer an abstract possibility, but an inevitable requirement, if the investigation was to escape the cycle of doubt and speculation that had lasted for decades. The cold case unit moved to the stage of direct DNA comparison as a pivotal step, because only highly reliable biological data would be strong enough to end the debate over whether the woman standing before them was truly the 2-year-old child who disappeared in Palmer in 1985. This comparison was conducted with the utmost caution, not only because of the legal significance of the results, but also because of the profound personal consequences for everyone involved, from the Johnson family to the person who had carried the new identity for many years. DNA samples were collected and directly compared with samples from Mary Johnson's surviving biological relatives, who agreed to participate in the process with a mixture of hope and caution, knowing that the results could open a door that had been closed for nearly 4 decades or close it definitively. The analysis took place within the framework of modern forensics, with strict standards for sample control, multi-locus comparison, and independent verification, to minimize as much as possible the chances of technical error or administrative mix-up, factors that had haunted earlier stages of the case. As the results began to take shape, the matching indicators did not appear as a single easily interpretable number, but as a consistent set of biological evidence showing a direct blood relationship far exceeding random chance or coincidence, sufficient to meet legal standards for identity confirmation. For the investigators, this was the moment when hypotheses built through layers of data finally had an objective anchor, where DNA not only confirmed a biological relationship, but also validated the entire chain of reasoning that had led them here. However, having scientific results in hand did not mean identity was immediately confirmed on the legal front, because the system requires a clear conclusion process, where DNA data must be placed alongside civil records, investigation reports, and other supporting evidence to form a comprehensive conclusion. The relevant agencies began reviewing birth certificates, missing person files, archived reports, and administrative documents that had formed the woman's current identity, to determine how the transition from one legal identity to another had occurred without creating new conflicts or legal gaps. The legal conclusion was built not only to confirm that the 2 DNA sets belonged to the same bloodline, but to officially declare that Mary Johnson, the child missing since 1985, had been found alive, and that the identity used for many years did not reflect her true biological origin. This process required coordination among investigative, forensic, and administrative agencies, because identity confirmation carried a series of legal consequences, from updating civil records to adjusting documents related to personal rights. For the system, this was a complex but necessary step to ensure that the conclusion was not only scientifically correct, but also legally valid, strong enough to withstand any future scrutiny. When the conclusion was completed and approved, the woman's identity was officially confirmed as Mary Johnson, marking the first time in nearly 40 years that the name no longer existed only in a cold case file or the lingering memories of a family, but was reattached to a living person who was present and had a voice. For those involved in the investigation, this moment of confirmation carried meaning beyond professional success, because it showed that a case once considered deadlocked could be resolved through the combination of modern technology and persistence in revisiting the past. However, that conviction came with necessary caution, because identity confirmation did not automatically answer every remaining question, nor did it erase the trauma accumulated over the years. For Mary, identity confirmation did not occur as an instant moment of relief, but as a profound shift in perception, where doubts that had existed quietly were now replaced by an undeniable truth, forcing her to confront the fact that her entire life had been built on a foundation that did not reflect her true origin. The feeling of confirmation carried both clarity and loss, because while the question "Who am I now?" had an answer, it also opened a series of new questions about who have I become during the time that identity was separated. For the Johnson family, the legal conclusion not only confirmed that their daughter was alive, but also forced them to adjust the way they had learned to live with loss, as hope once buried was suddenly revived in a completely different form. The official identity confirmation created a point of connection between past and present, where archived files, DNA data, and a flesh and blood person converged into a single recognized truth. On the investigative front, this was a major milestone, as it shifted the case from a state of search and hypothesis to one of confirmation and consequence management, where subsequent decisions were no longer based on speculation, but on a foundation agreed upon by law and science. Although the stage of reunion or facing deeper questions about what happened during the missing years had not yet been reached, identity confirmation closed a long chapter of uncertainty, putting an end to debates about whether Mary Johnson was still alive and replacing them with a clear truth that she had existed all those years under a different name. This moment, though recorded in legal documents and test results, carried the weight of an existential return, where an identity once detached from the real person was finally reattached, not as a perfect restoration of the past, but as a new anchor for re-understanding the entire journey that had been traveled. The official confirmation of identity placed the cold case unit before a task no less sensitive than the entire preceding investigation, because the scientific and legal truth now needed to be transformed into a human notification, delivered to those who had lived nearly 40 years in a state of both loss and fragile hope. Contacting the Johnson family was not done hastily, because the investigators understood that the manner of conveying the information was no less important than the information itself, and that an unprepared statement could cause irreversible psychological shock. Before reaching out, they reviewed the entire current family context, determining who was still alive, who had passed away, what the relationships among members were like, and how much they remained tied to the case after so many years. The initial contact was made discreetly and directly, without involving media or unnecessary intermediaries, to ensure that the family were the first to access the truth about their daughter. When the information was delivered, it was not presented as an absolute affirmation from the outset, but as a notification that there were very serious new findings related to the 1985 disappearance, important enough to require an in-person meeting. The family's initial reactions were not uniform, because each person had carried their own story of how they lived with that loss, and therefore each received the information through a different emotional lens. Some responded with prolonged silence, as if needing time to process the possibility that the unimaginable could be real, while others immediately asked a series of questions, not out of skepticism but out of fear that the hope just rekindled might be extinguished again. Preparation for the meeting between Mary and the Johnson family was carried out cautiously, not only logistically, but also psychologically, because experts recognized that this was not simply a reunion, but a collision between two realities that had developed in parallel for decades without intersection. Both sides were counseled about the likelihood of conflicting reactions, from intense emotion to confusion, from wanting to embrace to needing distance to protect themselves from emotional shock. Mary was informed in advance about the family's current status, about who was still alive to meet her, who was no longer, and about the irreversible changes that had occurred during her absence, to reduce the risk of unrealistic expectations. The Johnson family, in turn, was prepared to understand that the woman they were about to meet was not the 2-year-old child they had lost, but an adult with her own life history, memories, and identity formed in completely different circumstances. As the information that Mary was alive gradually sank in, the different reactions within the family became more evident, reflecting how each individual had coped with the disappearance in the past. Some welcomed the news with joy mixed with guilt, wondering if they had given up hope too soon, while others felt fear at the prospect of facing a truth that could disrupt the psychological balance they had struggled to build. These differences were not seen as signs of fracture, but as the natural consequence of a prolonged tragedy, where each person found their own way to survive. In the initial exchanges, questions did not focus only on where Mary had been, or why she disappeared, but also on how to proceed to the first meeting without causing further harm to either side. The investigators and support experts emphasized that there was no right or wrong way to react, that confusion, doubt, or even resistance were all reasonable responses to information of such weight. The preparation for the meeting was therefore not ceremonial or formal, but a process of adjusting expectations and boundaries, where both Mary and the Johnson family were encouraged to define the degree to which they were ready to share and receive. In this process, some family members expressed a desire to meet Mary immediately, as a natural emotional reflex, while others requested more time to prepare psychologically, fearing that a rushed meeting could leave new wounds. These differences forced the parties to compromise, finding a balanced approach between the need for connection and emotional safety, a problem with no simple solution. For Mary, notifying the Johnson family carried a special pressure, because she not only had to face people with direct blood ties, but also the entire history of loss, hope, and questions they had carried for many years. She understood that her presence could be both a gift and a disruption, and that not everyone would be ready to receive her in the same way. Meanwhile, the Johnson family had to learn to hold two opposing emotions at once: joy at knowing their daughter was alive and pain at realizing that most of her life had passed beyond their reach. The notification, therefore, did not end at the moment of conveying the information, but opened a new phase of emotional adjustment and negotiation, where every conversation could change how the parties viewed each other and themselves. When the date for the first meeting was planned, it was not seen as the end point of a journey, but as the beginning of a long and unpredictable process, where different reactions would continue to emerge and collide. The truth that Mary was alive had been confirmed, but how that truth would be integrated into the lives of the Johnson family and of Mary herself remained an open question, requiring patience, understanding, and acceptance, that not every gap could be filled immediately. In that state of waiting, notifying the family was not just an act of conveying news, but a subtle transition from the world of files and data to the world of people and emotions, where every subsequent decision had to consider not only what was right, but what was bearable for people who had lived too long with absence. The long preparations finally led to the moment that all parties both anticipated and dreaded, when Mary and the Johnson family met face to face for the first time since the day she disappeared. A meeting that did not take place in a dramatic or staged atmosphere, but was arranged in a neutral, private space where the goal was not to recreate an ideal family image, but to allow people with deep biological ties to confront each other under the safest possible conditions. The moment Mary entered the room did not carry the instant recognition that many had imagined, because between her and those waiting there were no shared memories to bridge the gap, only unfamiliar faces carrying expectations, fears, and a painful history that she had never lived through with them. For the Johnson family, seeing Mary as an adult did not match the image of the 2-year-old child frozen in their memories for decades, creating an emotional disconnect where the joy of knowing their daughter was alive collided with the pain of having missed her entire growing-up process. The meeting did not begin with immediate intimate gestures, but with evident caution, searching glances looking for familiar signs on the other's face, as if each side was trying to find a fragment of memory or familiar feeling to hold on to, even while understanding that it might not exist. The biological confirmation, already completed on paper and in the laboratory, was briefly reiterated in the meeting space, not to prove the truth again, but to establish a clear common foundation that the connection between them was no longer a hypothesis or abstract data, but a confirmed reality. This confirmation was more symbolic than scientific, as it allowed the parties to temporarily set aside any lingering doubts and focus on the present experience, even though that experience was full of contradictions and hard to define. The emotional distance quickly became apparent, not as rejection or coldness, but as the natural consequence of two lives that had developed independently under completely different circumstances. Mary faced people who shared her blood but not her memories, with no childhood stories to share, no small memories to act as glue, and so every interaction was exploratory and careful not to cross boundaries that she herself did not yet fully understand. The Johnson family, in turn, had to confront the reality that parental or familial affection could not be automatically restored just by biological truth, and that the woman before them had the right to maintain distance to protect herself from the pressure to return to a role she had never experienced. In the first minutes of the reunion, emotions fluctuated constantly between being moved, confused, and a mild form of psychological numbness, as the brain tried to process too much conflicting information and feelings at once. There was no single explosive emotional moment, but a series of small, sometimes contradictory reactions when a word or gesture unexpectedly touched a sensitive spot, bringing tears, followed immediately by an instinctive withdrawal to regain control. The immediate psychological effects of the meeting were evident on both sides, as Mary experienced overload, not because the Johnsons did anything wrong, but because the entire context forced her to confront a newly confirmed identity, and a relational system she had never been prepared to enter all at once. She felt an invisible pressure to react in some way, to show something commensurate with the expectations of people who had waited for years, while inside she was still struggling to adapt to the very truth just confirmed. The Johnson family, meanwhile, had to face the fact that the joy of reunion did not erase the years of loss, but sometimes made them even clearer, as every detail of Mary's current life became a reminder of what they had not been present to witness. Some members responded by seeking closeness quickly, trying to fill the void with affectionate gestures or rapid-fire questions, while others withdrew, fearing that moving too fast would hurt both sides. The supporting experts present were not there to control emotions, but to help the parties recognize that those opposing reactions were all reasonable in the context of a reunion delayed for so long, and that there was no obligation to reach a state of harmony immediately. Throughout the meeting, silence played a role no less important than words, with moments when no one knew what to say, and that silence was not forcibly filled, but allowed to exist as part of the getting acquainted process. Mary realized that being with her biological family did not immediately bring the sense of belonging she had once lacked, but it created a new kind of connection, fragile but real, based on presence and mutual acknowledgement rather than shared memories. The Johnson family, though not yet able to immediately see Mary as an inseparable part of their current lives, also began to realize that her existence in their lives did not have to follow a pre-existing emotional template, but could be built from small, slow interactions that respected boundaries. When the meeting ended, there was no feeling of closure or completion but a suspended state, where the parties left with many unprocessed emotions, but also with a shared awareness that a door had been opened, even if the path beyond it remained unclear. The immediate psychological aftermath continued after the reunion, as Mary experienced waves of emotional exhaustion interspersed with rare moments of clarity, where scattered memory fragments seemed to find new context. The Johnson family also faced deep psychological adjustment, as they learned to live with their daughter's presence in a form entirely different from what they had imagined. The reunion, therefore, was not the end of the journey, but a major psychological event that created immediate shocks and laid the foundation for long-term changes, where the biological truth had been confirmed, but emotional bonding still needed time, space, and patience to form, step by step, in a new reality that none of them had been fully prepared to enter. The psychological aftershocks from the reunion had barely settled when the focus of the case was forced back to a question delayed for decades: who was responsible for separating Mary from her family, and how could it happen without leaving strong enough traces to prevent it? The cold case unit began reviewing the entire list of old suspects from the 1985 file, not expecting to find a clear perpetrator, as in modern cases, but to assess whether individuals once noted still fit the new picture formed after Mary's identity was confirmed. Names that had been mentioned and quickly ruled out for lack of evidence, unidentified strangers, and individuals once considered without clear motive, were all brought back for analysis. This time through the lens of a successful kidnapping concealed long enough to bypass every system barrier. This review did not bring a sense of rapid progress, as most old suspects had either died or could no longer be effectively traced due to time erasing evidence and breaking the necessary chain of causation for prosecution. When cross-referencing Mary's life journey with potential suspects, investigators realized that many plausible scenarios no longer fit, while others could not be conclusively proven or disproven because they depended on evidence that no longer existed. Prosecution feasibility thus became a central issue no less complex than identifying the perpetrator, as even if a specific individual was linked, the legal system still faced barriers of statute of limitations, evidence standards, and rights of involved parties. Prosecutors consulted to evaluate whether any legal basis was strong enough for charges, gave cautious answers, emphasizing that confirming the victim's identity did not automatically mean having sufficient evidence for criminal accountability. After nearly 40 years, legal limits became clear as each scenario was analyzed, from kidnapping by a now deceased individual to possible assistance or negligence by others in the loose social context of the time, situations difficult to handle with current legal tools. The inability to ensure a fair trial due to missing witnesses, physical evidence, and faded memories became the deciding factor, stopping many prosecution paths at preliminary assessment. In this process, the question of responsibility gradually shifted from seeking a specific individual to examining the role of the system that allowed a kidnapping to occur and remain hidden for so long without detection. The twist of this phase lay in the fact that when all efforts to trace the perpetrator hit legal and practical limits, the case's moral focus began shifting to evaluating structural failures, from initial scene handling, prematurely ruling out abduction, to gaps in data management and federal coordination that enabled a child to vanish from the system without triggering strong enough alerts. Systemic responsibility is not an easy concept to accept, as it points to no specific target for blame or punishment, but it reflects an unavoidable truth that this case was not only the result of individual action, but also the consequence of accumulated decisions, assumptions, and limitations across many levels. Investigators, while continuing to review old suspects with necessary caution, also had to acknowledge that the chance of a clear legal outcome was increasingly slim, not from lack of good faith, but because time had reshaped the legal landscape unfavorably for late accountability. For Mary and the Johnson family, this created new tension as hope for complete truth collided with the reality that criminal justice does not always keep pace with moral or emotional justice. Some members wanted a specific individual held accountable as a way to close the story and end long-standing unease, while others began accepting that understanding what happened might matter more than who would be punished. In that context, tracing the perpetrator was no longer a linear journey toward a verdict, but a process of clarifying what could and could not be achieved within current law. The Cold Case Unit continued compiling findings, noting limitations, and making recommendations, not only on prosecution feasibility, but on lessons to prevent similar cases in the future. Systemic responsibility, when weighed, did not aim to replace individual responsibility, if identifiable, but to expand the concept of justice to include acknowledging structural failures that contributed to the tragedy. In that state, tracing the perpetrator closed not with a decisive conclusion but with a clear recognition that the case's truth existed on multiple layers, where individual action, legal limits, and systemic responsibility intertwined, and that confirming identity and reunion, though profoundly meaningful, did not automatically resolve all questions of accountability and justice hanging for nearly 4 decades. After all efforts to trace the perpetrator reached the insurmountable limits of law and time, the case entered a different space where the focus was no longer on what could be done next, but on what had been permanently lost. Lost evidence was the first and clearest reality, as the initial scene had not been preserved to standards that could withstand scrutiny decades later, causing any physical traces that once existed, if any, to be erased by weather, search activities, and the irreversible passage of time. Potential decisive evidence, from biological traces to seemingly minor details, no longer existed for modern technology analysis, and that absence was not the fault of any specific individual, but the consequence of the investigative context of that era, where reasonable assumptions then led to choices whose consequences only became clear in hindsight. Along with lost physical evidence was the permanent absence of many key witnesses who had died taking unverifiable memories with them, leaving gaps no retrieval technique could fill. Each lost witness was not just a person but a perspective, a possibility to confirm or deny details left hanging, and with them gone, questions about motive, opportunity, and event sequence became hypotheses without resolution. Surviving witnesses, though cooperative in the reinvestigation, could not compensate for this loss, as human memory is not an immutable archive, and what remained after decades was often mixed with truth, personal interpretation, and retellings over time. Gaps in records were thus not just missing documents, but the result of broken chains where administrative decisions, information standardization, and archival inertia smoothed over contradictions and uncomfortable details, turning a complex story into a neat but shallow summary. When rereading the file in the current context, those gaps appeared not as clear errors that could be fixed, but as permanently missing parts of the story, where there was no way to know if they once held the key, or were merely secondary details. Truth, in this context, did not exist as a complete entity recoverable with enough effort, but as a collection of surviving fragments, each valuable but insufficient for a full picture. For Mary, accepting this incomplete truth was a profound psychological challenge, as while her identity had been confirmed and part of the story clarified, the question of exactly what happened in the early days of her disappearance still lacked a definitive answer. She had to face the reality that she might never know who took her from Palmer, how, or why, and that scattered memories, nightmares, and psychological reflexes could only provide feelings, not a structured narrative. The Johnson family, in turn, had to learn to live with an outcome that brought hope yet left gaps, as their daughter had returned but the story of her disappearance remained without clear closure. What could not be resolved was thus not just investigative questions, but unmet emotional needs, as people often seek completeness in their stories to close a painful chapter. That incompleteness sometimes caused a sense of injustice, as if time had taken not only the years together, but also the right to know the full truth of what happened. In the legal context, the limits confirmed earlier continued to shape how the case was viewed, as inability to prosecute did not mean denying the pain or seriousness of the act, but reflected the difference between criminal justice and historical truth. Criminal justice requires strict evidence standards and procedures to protect everyone's rights, while historical truth often exists as probability and interpretation, especially when reconstructed after decades. Mary Johnson's case lay at that uncomfortable intersection, where what could be affirmed by science and law had been clarified, but what belonged to motive, context, and individual responsibility remained suspended. This incomplete truth forced those involved to adjust expectations, accepting that finding Mary alive did not automatically answer every question, and that some mysteries might have to be carried as part of the story, rather than fully resolved. For investigators, noting what could not be resolved was not surrender, but part of professional responsibility, to clearly distinguish evidence-based conclusions from unverifiable hypotheses, avoiding filling gaps with speculation that could cause further harm. The case file in its current state reflected that honesty, not trying to create a complete story at any cost, but clearly recording the limits of evidence and memory. This created a rare form of transparency, where the system acknowledged that not every case could be fully resolved, especially when time had distorted the investigative landscape. For Mary and the Johnson family, this acknowledgement was both liberating and painful, as it allowed them to stop waiting for a perfect explanation that might never come, but also forced them to face the remaining gaps as a permanent part of life. Unanswered questions, from who knew what at the time to whether someone could have intervened sooner, continued as shadows, neither erasable nor central to every future decision. In that context, what could not be resolved became a separate chapter of the story, not to prolong suffering but to set boundaries between what humans can know and what must be accepted as unknown. Living with incomplete truth requires a different kind of courage, not facing a perpetrator or dramatic event, but accepting that life does not always provide clear closure for its most painful chapters. Mary Johnson's case, viewed from this point, was not just a story of disappearance and discovery, but an illustration of how time, memory, and systems shape truth in imperfect ways, leaving unconnectable fragments that still hold meaning. Those fragments, though not forming a complete picture, were enough to remind that Mary's existence, her being found and confirmed, was not denied or diminished by the open questions. Instead, what could not be resolved highlighted the fragile boundary between provable truth and truth that must be accepted, a boundary those involved had to cross, if they wanted to continue living in the present without being forever trapped in the past. Accepting what could not be resolved created the necessary conditions for the case to be closed in the most honest way possible, not with a declaration that every question had an answer, but with a clear acknowledgement that everything possible had been done to the ultimate limits of evidence, law, and human memory. Mary Johnson's case was partially resolved in the most important sense. The 2-year-old child, who vanished from Palmer in 1985, was no longer an anonymous name on a missing persons list, but a living person, confirmed and restored to her true place in her own history and her family's story. This resolution did not take the complete form the public often expects in a criminal case, with an identified and punished perpetrator, but it held undeniable foundational value, as it ended the decades-long uncertainty about whether Mary was alive or dead, a question that had shaped every decision, hope, and pain of those involved. Restoring identity was not just a legal or administrative act, but a deeper process of re-establishing personhood, where Mary no longer had to live with a personal story broken without explanation, and the Johnson family no longer had to carry a frozen memory of a lost child without knowing her fate. Restoring this identity did not erase the lost years but redefined the meaning of loss, shifting it from absolute to something that could be contextualized, understood, and accepted. On the investigative side, the case closed as a rare example, showing that a cold case does not need to end with finding the perpetrator to be meaningful, but can hold great value simply by answering the most core questions. The significance of this case for other cold cases lies in how it was resolved, as the combination of modern DNA technology, genetic genealogy, and willingness to revisit old assumptions opened a different path for files thought forever frozen. It showed that record gaps, however large, could still be approached from new angles if the system was ready to accept that prior conclusions might not be final. At the same time, the case highlighted unavoidable limits of reinvestigation after decades, reminding that every early decision in a missing person case has long-term consequences, and that preserving the scene, fully recording statements, and maintaining openness to less likely hypotheses are factors that cannot be taken lightly. For investigative agencies, closing Mary Johnson's file did not mean denying past errors, but rather an official recognition that the system had learned something from its own limits, thereby adjusting approaches to similar cases in the future. The official file was closed, reflecting current reality. The victim had been identified and was alive, legal identity adjusted, and criminal accountability paths could not continue due to lack of evidence and legal limits. This closure was not an act of erasure but a necessary completion to prevent the case from lingering in limbo, where unrealistic expectations could cause further harm to those who had suffered enough. For Mary, the file closure held deep personal meaning, as it allowed her to begin a new life phase no longer defined by missing status, though past psychological effects still needed time and support to process. Official identity recognition gave her autonomy in how to connect with her biological family, how to retell her story, and what to make central in her current life, rather than letting the past dictate every step. The Johnson family, though still carrying unanswered questions, could shift from weary waiting to adapting to a new reality, where their daughter existed as an adult, with her own history, not as a permanent symbol of loss. Closing the case thus did not erase pain but set a clear boundary between past and present, allowing those involved to begin restructuring their lives without being trapped in loops of speculation and indefinite hope. On a broader level, Mary Johnson's case became a powerful reminder that every cold case contains multiple layers of truth, not all excavatable, but any layer clarified holds great human and social value. It showed that restoring identity to a person is not just legal but an act of restoring dignity and personal history, which can have deeper impact than convicting a specific perpetrator. When the file was marked closed, it did not shut the story in collective memory, but reshaped how it would be remembered, no longer as a hopeless disappearance, but as a complex journey full of errors and limits, yet ultimately leading to a truth large enough to change the lives of those involved. Closing the case in this sense was not absolute end, but completion of an investigative cycle where the system acknowledged what was achieved and what could not be, thereby passing the next responsibility to people for healing, adaptation, and continuing to live with a reality now clearly named. The case was closed on paper, but its meaning continued as a reference standard for how society faces disappearance, memory, and identity, reminding that even when justice cannot be perfect, restoring core truth to a person remains an undeniable victory. The story of Mary Johnson shows that America today, though far more modern than Palmer, Alaska in 1985, can still have gaps appear if we become complacent or believe bad things only happen elsewhere. The first lesson lies in the initial mistake of the Palmer community. Because of trust and familiarity, they overlooked early unusual factors and let a very short supervision gap turn into disaster. In modern American life, this reminds us not to live in fear but to build practical safety habits, set clear rules for young children who can pick them up, family password, check immediately on any odd sign, and report early and specifically rather than self-reassure. The second lesson comes from the system. The case veered off because abduction was ruled out too early. The scene was not properly preserved, and the file went cold with small errors overlooked. For parents and communities, proactively preserve data, updated photos, identifying features, fingerprints, DNA, if possible, and record timelines right when an incident occurs. Those details can decide later investigations. The third lesson is the power of technology, but also personal responsibility. Mary only began discovering who she was when she dared face her cognitive gap and took a DNA test, then genetic genealogy, led back to Alaska. If you grew up with vague records, missing papers, or a feeling of not belonging, don't suffer alone. Seek psychological support, review legal records, and use modern tools cautiously. Finally, the story reminds us that reunion does not automatically heal. Mary and her family had real emotional distance, so the practical lesson is to respect boundaries, go slow, seek professional counseling, and allow complex emotions to coexist. That is how truth arriving late can still become the starting point for a stronger life. If the story of Mary Johnson has made you think about cold cases thought long forgotten, and the power of truth rediscovered after many years, please subscribe to the channel to continue joining us on the journey to find stories not yet fully told. Thank you for watching to the very end, and see you in the next video, where another file will be opened, with secrets waiting to be seen in the light.